Just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination.
Apartheid is an Afrikaans word meaning separateness or the state of being apart. So why is Israel called an apartheid state? In 1961, the South African Prime Minister and architect of South Africa's apartheid policies, Hendrik Verwoerd, himself recognized the similarities between his country and Israel. He dismissed Israel's vote against South African apartheid at the United Nations, saying, "Israel is not consistent in its new anti-apartheid attitude. They took Israel away from the Arabs after the Arabs lived there for 1,000 years. In that, I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state." The crime of apartheid under the Apartheid Convention and Rome Statute consists of three primary elements: an intention to maintain a system of domination by one racial group over another, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, one or more inhumane acts as defined carried out on a widespread or systematic basis pursuant to those policies. Inhumane acts included in both the International Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute include forcible transfer, expropriation of landed property, creation of separate reserves and ghettos, the right to leave and to return to their country, and the right to a nationality, welcome to life for Palestinians in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. In addition, the Rome Statute describes the crime against humanity of persecution as the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity, including on racial, national, or ethnic grounds. Since the foundation of the State of Israel, via the ethnic cleansing of up to 300,000 Palestinians from their ancestral homelands by Zionist militias in the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, and Israel's subsequent occupation of further territory after the 1967 war, there are now two groups in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories: Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, ruled by a primary sovereign, the Israeli government. A stated aim of this government is to ensure that Jewish Israelis maintain domination across Israel and the occupied territories. In 2018, Israel passed a law with constitutional status affirming Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, declaring that within that territory the right to self-determination is unique to the Jewish people, and establishing Jewish settlement as a national value. To maintain Jewish-Israeli control, Israeli authorities have systematically implemented measures designed to contain what it calls the demographic threat presented by Palestinians. Those policies include limiting the population and political power of Palestinians, granting the right to vote only to some Palestinians who live within the borders of Israel as they existed from 1948 to June 1967, limiting the ability of Palestinians to move to Israel from the occupied territories. Other steps which are taken to ensure Jewish domination are the official separation of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, preventing the movement of people and goods within and between the occupied territories, and the Judaization of areas with significant Palestinian populations, such as the current home evictions being witnessed in Sheikh Jarrah. These measures aim to consolidate Jewish-Israeli control over land, while forcibly concentrating Palestinians into severely crowded populations with restricted access to land, housing, and resources, while encouraging and supporting Jewish and Jewish-dominated communities to grow and flourish. Israel often boasts of being the only democracy in the Middle East, and that its Palestinian citizens enjoy full and equal rights, but this is far from the truth. Palestinians are subject to completely separate and unequal treatment compared to Jewish Israeli settlers. In the occupied West Bank, Palestinians are subject to a brutal system of military law and segregation. In the Gaza Strip, Palestinians live in the largest open-air prison on earth. In annexed East Jerusalem, occupied territory under international law, Palestinians have an inferior legal status that weakens their residency rights, allowing them to be forcibly evicted from their homes, while Palestinians in Israel, but not the occupied territories, have the right to vote and participate in Israeli elections. These rights still do not help them overcome systemic discrimination. In the early 1970s, Palestinians began to compare Israeli proposals for Palestinian autonomy to the Bantustan strategy of South Africa, which would essentially see a series of tightly controlled ethnic ghettos, rather than actual political autonomy. In the 1990s, the term Israeli apartheid gained prominence after Israel, as a result of the Oslo Accords, granted Palestinians limited self-government in the form of the Palestinian Authority, and established a suffocating system of permits and checkpoints. Allegations of apartheid grew further following Israel's construction of the West Bank barrier. Israel continues to punish Palestinians in the occupied territories with a number of ongoing abuses: severe restrictions on the movement of 4.7 million Palestinians, the confiscation of land, harsh conditions including the denial of building permits, the denial of residency rights to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and their relatives, the suspension of basic civil rights such as freedom of assembly and association. On top of this system of control comes the war crimes committed as Israel has routinely attacked Gaza under the guise of fighting terrorism. In recent weeks, public opinion has shifted radically, as home evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and Israel's attacks on Gaza have illustrated the brutality of Israel's system of control over the Palestinian people. The question is, how long can it continue?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A very good afternoon to everyone tuning in to BDS Malaysia's webinar titled Is Israel a Jewish or an Apartheid State? Thank you to everyone for joining us today, wherever you're joining from. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Together with us today are two esteemed guests, no strangers to BDS Malaysia, Dr. Peter Slizak and Dr. Sol Takahashi. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ezra. Nice to see you both.
Hi, Ezra. Good to see you.
How's life? I mean, everyone's got to ask, how's COVID life these days for you guys? Peter, you're in Sydney. Sol, you're in Tokyo. How's it going there? Peter?
In Sydney, we're in lockdown, a new lockdown, which is planned for the whole of September coming. We've just got a growth in the number of cases, so we're and some suburbs are more affected than others, so it's not good at the moment.
Yep, and I hear lockdown fatigue. Yeah, people in the streets protesting against lockdown, just suffering from lockdown fatigue. Basically.
Yeah, it's tough on some people.
Yeah, and Saul, yourself.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have those kind of mandatory lockdowns, not because the government wouldn't want to do it if it had the tools to do it, but just because there's no legal basis to do it. So, I mean, there are these kind of declarations of states of emergency, and restaurants are asked to close early and not to serve alcohol and all that kind of stuff. And they're all sorts of, what I would say relatively minor sort of measures compared to a full-blown, lockdown where people are stopped and fined if they're, walking on the streets, that kind of thing. But there's a huge amount of fatigue. I mean, same kind of thing. I mean, people are sick of it. I'm sick of it. People are tired of what they see as having been their normal lives just being, just sort of fading away and not being able to go back to do the kind of fun stuff that we all used to be able to do before. So that's a big thing. And not being able to travel, of course, to come see you guys in Malaysia and Australia is a big thing for me. That's for sure. It's very tough.
Of course. Even here in Malaysia, I don't know what life is other than lockdown. Since March last year, it's been one lockdown after another, right? And I think to get back to life before lockdown is going to take a bit of adjustment, I think. Anyway, gentlemen, let's get back to our topic today. Is Israel a Jewish or an apartheid state? And before we get into it, I just want to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Peter Slizak, you're currently an honorary associate professor of philosophy at the University of New South Wales, Australia. And your research and teaching include philosophy of science, religion, the mind, language, Galileo, and Descartes. That's quite something. It sounds...
It means abstract. I'm a dilettante.
Sorry?
It means I'm a dilettante.
Okay. It sounds abstract, right? Philosophy of the mind, and but at the same time, it's so exciting to me. You're also the co-founder of the advocacy group Independent Australian Jewish Voices, and an executive member of Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network and Palestine Support Network of Australia. You write opinion articles, you appear in the media, public lectures, debates on science, education, religion, and politics. I actually caught, I think, a 2 or 3 hour debate, you and another person on atheism. God,
yes, I've done some very interesting public debates with, I'm an atheist, but I've debated with both Muslim and Christian scholars about the fundamentals of religion and God. It's been very interesting. I had a very big public debate.
I caught one of that, the full lecture, to be honest with you, I did. This is pre-COVID days. Welcome to our webinar, Peter. And Saul, you're a professor of human rights and peace studies at the Osaka Jogakuin University in Osaka. You were also the deputy head of office at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in occupied Palestine for 5 years. And in that time, you lived in Jerusalem and traveled throughout both the West Bank and Gaza, monitoring and documenting human rights violations. So that must have been quite an experience, 5 years. Yep.
Yeah, it was something, for sure. It was something.
Yeah. You've also written several books, including The Palestinian People Continue to Suffer, Why the UN Can't Solve the Problem. That's not very hopeful, is it? But,
well, I try to be hopeful, but also realistic, I guess. Anyway,
yeah.
It's the publishers that decide the title, not me.
And welcome, Saul, to our webinar.
It's great to be here. Great to see you both.
Okay, so let's get into it. I'll start with you, Saul. We saw in the video earlier, that Israel claims to be the only democracy in the Middle East. And let's try and define what democracy is and see if Israel fits that bill. Saul?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think the video which you showed pretty much said it all, or a lot of the things that I think we were going to talk about. It was a great introduction. Israel, of course, always calls itself the only democracy in the Middle East, and it uses this term democracy intentionally to promote itself and to try to make it seem like it's a Western liberal democracy along the same kind of model that other Western liberal democracies. Basically, it's targeting, in particular, the United States and European countries, Australia, those kind of countries in particular, when it says those kind of things. Defining democracy is, of course, always a slippery kind of thing. But one thing that I think is really important to stress is that when we talk about liberal democracies, one integral part, it's not just about, whether elections are held on a regular basis and we're not really sure who is going to get power after the elections. I think it's a much broader and more comprehensive concept than that. And of course, definitely includes respect for fundamental human rights. One thing that we can talk about what a democracy is for a very long time until the day is done. But one thing I think a democracy can't be, and I think there's certainly a consensus on this, is a country that defines itself exclusively as the property or the country of a particular ethnic group or a particular religious group. This is clearly not on. And the problem with the state of Israel as it is now and as it has been since its conception is that's precisely what it is. It's a nation state. It defined itself, or the government of Israel has always defined itself as the state of the Jewish people, only of the Jewish people, and only for the Jewish people. And so here I think Israel very much fails the test of whether we can call it a democracy. And those kind of terms that it uses, those kind of propaganda terms of being the only democracy in the Middle East, that's really, it's trying to deflect attention from those very fundamental points, I would say. Yeah. Oh dear, you're. I think you're muted. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. We still make that mistakes, unbelievably, right? We still make mistakes like that after a year and a half of webinars. Yeah. And Peter, on to you. So at the same time, Israel claims to be a Jewish state. Can it be both? Can it be a democracy and a Jewish state? Or is it really a Zionist and apartheid state? Bearing in mind the rights of its non-Jewish citizens?
Well, look, Saul touched on it very appropriately, and I can just add to some of the very important remarks that Saul had made. It's interesting, as he said, that it has never been conceived as other than a state for the Jews, and they've had to tolerate, as they see it, what were the original inhabitants, that they've had to somehow deal with what they call the demographic problem. These are the native, inhabitants. Palestinians often say, like the Knesset member, the former Knesset member, Hanin Zouabi, she said she didn't come here, she didn't migrate here. This is her country. Well, the history of this is very interesting. I'll make a few quick remarks to add to what Saul said. I have a few remarks that the former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made. He said, I'm quoting directly, he said, the terms democracy or democratic are totally absent from the Declaration of Independence. This is not an accident, he says. And he goes on to explain, as we know, it was from the beginning intended to be a state for the Jews. And it's amazing that the world has put up with this. And there are very many other dimensions to it. It's not just, as Sol said, the rights that are deprived for the Palestinians who live there. And even apart from now the brutal occupation in the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza, even for the citizens of the state of Israel, there's an important distinction. They distinguish between citizenship and nationhood. That's a unique distinction in the world. And there are other features of this that are interesting. They have, just quickly, what they call, from the 1950s, a law of return. Now, this is interesting because it's not the international right of return that the Palestinians have. It's the law of return, which it gives Jews like myself more rights than the Palestinians who are still holding the key to their house. And so this is the kind of system that they have. I mean, I can go there and become a citizen, whereas Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 can't. So this is an extraordinary situation, and Jews accept this around the world. The diaspora Jews accept this. So these are other aspects of what is really the extraordinary nature of a state. And in fact, although they keep using, as Sol says, this sort of propaganda rhetoric, that it's a democratic and Jewish state, that's a contradiction. It's like being red and blue, or, you can't have both. And of course, as that nice little video pointed out, the nation state law in 2018 enshrined these discriminatory laws as part of their foundational documents. So the whole place is extraordinary. And as the document also mentioned, I think they mentioned just recently, even Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem have now officially come out with reports. So it's no longer a question of South Africa. And I think even the mention of South Africa is a distraction, because it mentioned the international law that Sol can explain better, the ICC and the Rome Statute, which makes this legally, as other reports have said, a case. There are many other aspects. I just mentioned quickly another aspect which is important. The NGO Adala, based in Haifa, is a legal center for Arab minority rights. It has on its database 50 or 60 laws which officially discriminate against the Palestinians. So the whole idea is a joke that they could even pretend and get away with in the West. It's a comment on the Western media that they don't that they report this blandly, as if it's not open to outrage and really ridicule.
Actually, could I just? I'd like to follow on something that Peter just said. Of course, completely in agreement with everything you said. Well, but one thing you said reminded me of something about the sort of the idea of whether Israel is a Jewish state or a democratic state, or it's both, or what, it's often presented as both, and sometimes it's not. And like you mentioned, the Western media completely they just sort of let this through without any kind of issue. And it's also the same with Western governments. And this is what having worked in the UN and everything, and seeing policy pronouncements by, for example, the Americans or the Europeans, and they're talking about if Israel were to annex the West Bank, for example, and then that would mean, it's already been de facto annexed. We can talk about this in later. But if Israel were to go ahead and legally annex the West Bank, what would it mean? It would mean that there would be millions more Palestinians who, if they were given the right to vote in Israeli elections, would be, they would be a significant voting force, of course. So it's always presented as this being some kind of gigantic dilemma. So does Israel, if Israel couldn't possibly extend voting rights to this population, so does it want to be a Jewish state, or does it want to be a democratic state? This is the choice. As if this is some kind of legitimate choice here. That's right. As if it's some kind of perfectly fine. We're going to annex the land, but we're not going to give these people voting rights because we want to remain a Jewish state, and that's just how it is. And the way that this is presented as somehow some kind of normal policy choice, policy preference is really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just doing this the same mistake again, I'm afraid.
Peter, you said earlier that comparing it to South Africa and apartheid is a distraction. But we often do that, right? Even the BDS movement does that. Can you just elaborate on why you think it's a distraction? Why do you say that?
One reason is that the Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, uses that against the protest movement by saying that there are differences and it's not like South Africa, and they will use this and avoid the legal issues which we've mentioned that are the relevant issues. In a way, in fact, there's a word in Hebrew which means apartheid. It's hafrada. They have their own word. It means separation. It's the same. It's just not an Afrikaans word. So, I mean, I think the historical background, of course, is the South African case, but I think that that tends to focus on the conditions which were, after all, different, and the differences are less important than what I think are the legal issues, which are now so well documented and spelled out.
All right. Saul, would you agree with that? Do you think there are parallels between the South African and Israeli cases, the two of them?
I mean, for sure. I mean, for sure, there are parallels, and like Peter, I also believe that obsessing about the South African example is not so helpful, because it opens the door to, as you mentioned, the Zionist lobby coming and saying, but there was this difference and there was that difference. And one thing that the introductory video did touch upon, but if you don't know too much about the Palestinian issue, people might get a little bit confused about, is the situation of Palestinians within the state of Israel that have the citizenship of Israel. They have Israeli citizenship. These are people predominantly, who were not ethnically cleansed in 1948. So they mainly were people in Christian cities such as Nazareth and around there, where European governments were keeping a very close eye on what was going on. So you have this population, it's nearly 2 million people now, of people who were not ethnically cleansed in 1948, and they have Israeli citizenship. Now, the reason that I'm explaining this is because the Israelis often, they trot these people out and say, yeah, but they have, we treat them perfectly well. It's not like South Africa at all. These people have completely equal rights. And I've actually come across Israelis who say with a straight face, they actually have more rights than we do as Jewish Israelis. You've heard this too, Peter, for sure, because they don't have to go to the army, this kind of stuff. And yes, they're not welcomed in the army. They can't go if they really want to, but obviously that's not something which most of them want to do. But for having not served in the army, that actually makes a lot of issues for them later on in terms of getting government assistance and all that. But like you mentioned, Adalah it's actually over 60 laws that Palestinian citizens of Israel are subject to blatant and open discrimination. So there are those, there are similarities, there are differences, but like Peter rightly pointed out, there is an international convention against, to suppress the crime of apartheid. The international crime of apartheid is mentioned specifically in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So unlike what the Zionist lobby would like a lot of people to believe, it's not the case that apartheid just ended when the South African apartheid regime came to an end. It's not that apartheid is only linked to South Africa, and once South Africa abandoned it, well, that's just like that's just like propeller planes or something. We just don't use them anymore. They don't exist. It's not the case at all. It's an international crime which still remains, and like the introductory video mentioned, it has these elements of grave human rights violations that are systemic and done within a system of oppression to ensure domination of one ethnic or racial group over another. And that describes perfectly the situation of Israel, frankly. I mean, it is, Israel discriminates against all Palestinians. There are different categories, if you like, people with Israeli citizenship, people in the West Bank and Gaza who do not have Israeli citizenship, people in East Jerusalem who have a very precarious residency situation, and the refugees who have the internationally recognized right to return to their homes, and yet they are completely barred from this. While at the same time, like Peter, like you mentioned, under the right of return, any person who has, I think, one Jewish grandparent can just raise, anywhere in the world, they can just raise their hands, and
now even the spouses of Jews, they've changed the
yes,
rules.
They changed that when the Russians.
My wife was Catholic. She has more rights than a Palestinian.
Exactly. You exactly. So this system of complete domination over any Palestinian, regardless of where they are, and those kind of legal statuses. This is really what makes what is the hallmark of an apartheid system. Yeah. So for sure, the Israeli regime right now is a complete and total apartheid system.
If I could just jump in to add something, I think in some ways, even talking about apartheid is understating how serious it is. Yeah. Look, the reality in the West Bank, and certainly in Gaza, is much worse than apartheid. I mean, the West Bank is under a brutal military occupation where they're rampaging around, brutalizing the Palestinians. So that's not just apartheid. That's much worse. And Gaza is even worse. Yeah.
No, I agree. They never, one thing that South Africans always say, South African, former anti-apartheid activists, and of course I have a couple of friends who were South African, and then they had Jewish heritage, and they actually moved to Israel, and they became Israeli citizens, but they are very prominent in the activist in the world, and they mentioned that you've heard this before, that in South Africa there were never segregated roads, whereas in of course, as in the West Bank there are segregated. So that's just a very simple example, a very easy example of showing just how, in fact, in many ways, it's worse.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Now let's train our guns on the media for a bit. Yeah, Peter. There is such a heavy pro-Israel bias in our mainstream media, right? We see little shifts that give us this window of optimism and hope, but by and large, there's this blanket pro-Israel bias. Okay, first question: why do you think there is this pro-Israel bias? And two, how has the Israeli Jewish citizenry bought into this?
Look, before I answer the question directly, let me say something indirect that I think is important. This whole question of the bias in the media is a very fraught one. I spent a lot of my time reading and thinking about this, and I'll get back to your question more directly. But the first thing to say is that, again, the enormously influential Israel lobby figures, they have, of course, the opposite view. Their view is that the media are heavily biased against Israel, and they're very effective in harassing the media. In Australia, for example, the ABC, the moment there's the slightest criticism of Israel, the media are barraged with complaints, and they have to respond to them. So that's the context in which we have to try to deal with this and to try to make some objective assessment. Obviously, one way to assess it objectively is you can't just look at what's presented in the media. You have to know independently what's going on the ground in Israel-Palestine, and then look at how much is covered. And the reality is that it's hardly covered at all. I mean, just in the last few weeks, they've shot dead, I don't know how many unarmed Palestinian citizens in the West Bank, and they're not reported. So the question of bias has to be looked at in some sensible, objective way in relation to what's going on there. But your question was, why is there the pro-Israel bias? Let me try and address that quickly. I think, firstly, it's part of a much bigger problem with the media. It has to do with the systematic bias that the Western media, even the not the corporate media, but even like the ABC or in Britain, the BBC, they're part of a system which is part of a propaganda system. I'm thinking, of course, of Noam Chomsky's important landmark work with Edward Herman on the manufacture of consent, and the way in which our intellectual culture is organized to protect our entire system against proper criticism. And so if you look at the studies of wherever we're on the wrong side, wherever we're the perpetrators of violence and crimes, in Latin America, in Vietnam, in East Timor, the Western media have always played this role of being propagandists for the power and our own interests. And this is even the independent media like the ABC. Now, this is a long and complicated story, but the situation of Israel has to be put into that context. Of course, there are other aspects to this which are worth mentioning. Edward Said wrote, again, a very important book on this called Covering Islam. And part of the problem, of course, is that we're dealing with largely Muslim populations. The Palestinians are not all Muslim, but a large part of it. And they're part of this syndrome of stereotyping of Palestinians, and that's another difficulty that we have, and an aspect of the problem. So there are all these aspects to the way in which the Western media are systematically biased against showing just the realities on the ground. I once spoke to a journalist. I was in Palestine, and I spoke to one of the ABC people, and I asked them why they're not covering what's going on in Palestine. And it's a rather interesting but understandable reaction. I mean, you can cover one house getting demolished, you can cover one person getting shot, but you can't do it every day, every time it happens. There's something about the logic of the media that means when it's happening systematically, constantly, the number of house demolitions, there've been 50 or 60,000 houses demolished. And as I say, every couple of days, a Palestinian is shot dead or beaten up. Well, somehow it's not an option for the media to do it on a constant basis. And so basically it's hidden. It's not visible. And so there's that side of it. The other question you asked was something about how the Jewish citizenry has bought into the bias. Well, there's an obvious answer to that. It's hard to believe, but I think that not just the diaspora Jews, but the Israeli population are to a very large extent ignorant of what's going on. A lot of people who are informed find this hard to believe, but I'm quoting people like the journalist Gideon Levy, who's one of the most important commentators on the horrors. And he is telling us how the Jewish population in Israel are ignorant of what's happening a few kilometers away in Gaza or in the West Bank. There's some way in which they maintain this. Well, I mean, the mainstream media simply don't show it there. And here too, the Jewish communities are kept in a bubble. And I mean, I watch the Jewish media and their attempts to deal with this. To a very large extent, they're in ignorance. And when some facts sneak out that are uncomfortable, they will make excuses for it in terms of Israel defending itself or some other rhetoric. So it's a very serious problem. And I think that's one of the major issues, especially among diaspora Jews, although to be a bit more optimistic, it's changing. Norman Finkelstein wrote a book several years ago now called They Know Too Much. And especially in America, the Jews are mainly sort of progressive. They're Democrat voters, and they're progressive on every other issue except Palestine, but they're starting to find out how bad it is. And recently there have been some very significant developments. Peter Beinart and various others who are mainstream, practicing, essentially Zionists, and they're starting to dissent and repudiate the crimes. And so these are shifts which are, I think, a significant indicator of maybe some hope.
Right. So is there anything you'd like to add to that? Media?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for sure, I agree with everything Peter just said. I think one of the things that I always, having lived there for 5 years, having interacted with Jewish Israelis on many different sort of situations. I mean, not just me as a UN guy versus an IDF guy, but in more different sort of personal kind of situations as well. One thing that really struck me was that people, I agree with you, they don't know, but they also didn't want to know. Yeah. I mean, that was the sense that I very much got. Yeah. This is not unique to Jewish Israelis, unfortunately, but it was so pronounced because it really struck me how, like you said, just a few kilometers away, and all of them have gone to the army. It is not an option not to go to the army. I mean, this is how it is. And if you're a male, then you generally will have served in a combat unit, which means you will have gone to the West Bank or along the frontier with Gaza, and you have maintained the system of oppression in a very active, in-your-face way. But they do that for their 3 years or however long they want to stay in the army. They come back. They just want to forget about it. They don't want to talk about it, which is why organizations like Breaking the Silence are so, amazing and groundbreaking. And they somehow, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't really know what I'm talking about. Somehow they compartmentalize that part of their lives. And one thing that has really, I think, added to this is the apartheid wall. And all the movement restrictions, all the systemic things which have made it nearly impossible, or at least extremely difficult, for Palestinians and Jewish Israelis to mix in any kind of way. I mean, it used to be the case, certainly before the Second Intifada, even before the first, most of the like the construction site jobs, most of these kind of jobs in the state of Israel were done by Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza who came with permits. Now, of course, that was an exploitative relationship, but it was a relationship. I mean, there was at least people, you were there, at least you were interacting, and there was Jewish Israelis would see these people and they would say, these are actually not so bad, and they're not necessarily all terrorists, But with the wall, and the wall is just part of it, all these kind of movement restrictions, it's really this apartheid system where people grow up without having met a Palestinian. Except during their army days when they don't meet them, they're just looking at them through the finder of a gun sight. So I think this all really adds to it. And I remember when I was in Palestine, I was talking with a Jewish Israeli. She was a human rights lawyer, and she was not dealing with the Palestinian cause. Her specialty was human rights law, and she was dealing with humanitarian law and in a more sort of academic way. Anyway, but this was during the time when the Syrian war had just gone major. It was blowing up. Everything was blowing up. And we in the UN, we were looking and seeing how the attention of the international community and the attention of diplomats and policymakers in UN fora, that they weren't looking at Palestine at all. They were saying, Palestine was good. Forget that. We got to deal with Syria now. So everything was going on. Syria and the other Arab countries, everything was just falling apart. And we were having to fight within the UN to get attention to Palestine. But anyway, so that was the context, and I was talking with this person. Actually, it just wasn't her. There were a number of others, and we were in a group, and they were saying, but you people in the UN, I mean, the human rights analysis, we can agree or disagree, but you've got to stop this obsession with Israel. I mean, look, you're not talking about Syria at all. And I said, look, I'll show you the website here and now. I'll show you the UN Human Rights website here and now. What do you mean we don't talk about Syria? We only talk about Syria now. That's the problem. But and this is not like some countries like China where access to the internet is restricted and it's difficult. It's not the case. I mean, they really do have the ability to see these things, and yet they don't want to. I think they just don't want to see it. I always got the sense that facing this kind of reality and this kind of, having to face the reality that their country is not the good guy, that their people are not, the victims, that the IDF is not the most moral army in the world. They criticize the government, they criticize politicians, they criticize, the capitalist class, they criticize the rich. This is never an issue in Israel. But when it comes to criticizing the IDF, this is a different story. And to somehow face the facts about what the IDF and what Israel as a country is doing, I just felt that they just didn't want to do it. They wanted to look the other way.
In fact, what you're saying is very important, Sol, and if I could just add to it quickly, it's not just what Israel is doing now. They still can't face the crimes of 1948 properly.
No, that's
a major trauma to face what now, after all, is a 70-year-old history. I mean, we in Australia can't face what we did a couple of hundred years ago to the Aboriginals either. But, I mean, that's quite common. But you're absolutely right about the psychology of it. I'm finding my Jewish friends, one in particular who's made a very significant, he's formerly Israeli. He's come a long way to where we are on this. But he tells me, don't send him videos every couple of days about what's going on there. He can't cope with it emotionally. So your point is a very important one.
Yeah, I understand.
All right, Peter, are we adding any weight to this discourse then? This we're holding webinars after webinars, and we've been involved in this course as activists for many years. Are we adding weight to this discourse then?
That's a really tough question, Azra, to ask. Are we doing any good, you mean? Are we making a difference? Look, I think the answer is yes. Otherwise, we'd do something else. But I think it's incremental. I mean, as always, let me give an example, which I think is an optimistic answer to your question. nobody thought that the Indonesian occupation of East Timor would ever end. It was a terrible atrocity. I mean, it was close to a genocide. They killed about a third of the population. And I was privileged to be involved with the activists here in Sydney and Australia. And we had the same sense of desperation about, it was really awful. Well, look, it ended. And I have to say that I think it's to the credit of the activists around the world that kept the issue alive against all the odds. I mean, they kept doing what we're doing, and, their meetings and the rallies and whatever they held, writing letters. It seems hopeless, but I think actually it has an effect. We'd like it to change instantly, but we're seeing changes. I mean, I'm privileged, as you mentioned, to be on a couple of committees here. We lobby the politicians, and it's very frustrating that it's so slow in getting any consciousness. But, things have changed a lot. It used to be that you couldn't even talk about Palestine. The media wouldn't mention the word. And so, look, I'm seeing some grounds for shift, as I said to you, even within the Jewish community, which I think is crucial. So I keep saying there was a case in Ireland, to go back to the South African case, of the Dunn's stores where a couple of women, checkout women, decided not to process some oranges or something. That led to the whole country, Ireland, instituting a policy of boycott, and it had a political impact. So I think these small cases of activists and spreading the word and raising people's conscience, I think it has some importance. So yes, I don't think we should give up.
That's great to know. All right, now let's go back to BDS. Yeah, it's been how many years now? It started as a grassroots movement in Palestine by the Palestinians themselves, and it's growing worldwide. We see it, right? So, Saul, can you just touch on how important BDS is and how successful has it been?
Well, BDS is crucial. I mean, mobilizing international civil society really, I believe, is the only way that we were really going to make progress. Peter, I completely agree with you. We're not, it's incremental change, and it's not necessarily change that we don't necessarily see this kind of change immediately. Inshallah, we will see it in our lifetime. I do think we'll see it in our lifetime. But things have already been changing. I mean, things are changing. I mean, if you look, I think, if we look at, for example, opinion surveys in the United States, for example, and the attitudes towards Israel, the blatantly pro-Israel bias is already shifting. Yeah, it's shifting amongst young people more. It's shifting amongst people who vote for the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party a little bit more. But it is shifting, and it's also shifting. There was a very interesting survey a couple of weeks ago, I think, or maybe it was a couple of months ago, about opinions also in the evangelical community, the Christian evangelical community. Many of whom are Christian Zionists, and again have a very die-hard attitude towards protecting Israel. There's also been a noticeable shift there. So things are changing, and I think BDS is a big part of that and an important part. And that itself is already a big success. BDS, we can point to various sort of specific examples of we've pressured companies into not doing business with Israel. We've pressured companies like Ben & Jerry's, that would never have happened without the BDS movement and those kind of things. And the other side can trot out statistics about, the economic punch is really not that big, and it's actually not such a big deal. But it goes much more beyond, I think, the dollars and cents. It's really, when we look at South Africa, what brought the South African apartheid regime down? It was this international boycott. Not that it brought South Africa, to economic ruin. No, it didn't. But it was the lack of international legitimacy that really brought the apartheid regime down. And that's where it's heading now. I mean, the writing is on the wall. In my mind, there's absolutely no question. And that's why the government of Israel is going crazy about this. They've identified BDS as an existential threat. They're pouring, millions and millions of dollars into efforts against it. And if you look at the United States, I mean, it says something about the corruption of the American political process, that a huge number of states. Last I checked, it was over 25 had passed some sort of law, not outlawing BDS outright, because that's very difficult to do, but at least preventing state governments from doing any kind of business with people who boycott Israel, these kind of things. And they're still pushing to do it at the federal level. But this, and not to mention all the stuff that they're doing in universities, pressuring universities not to give tenure to pro-Palestinian professors, all this kind of thing. But they're going crazy about it precisely because they know this is really going to hurt. This is going to be the end. And I really think BDS, is crucial. It's not everything, but it is a crucial part of this whole thing about pointing to the violations of international law and justice by the state of Israel and trying to bring them to account.
If I could add to that, you're quite right. If I just reinforce a point you made, the hysteria of the Israeli government in reaction to the Ben and Jerry ice cream boycott, the overreaction to that is so significant. They were threatening them and they're calling it anti-Semitic, and that's a very good indication of how significant the boycott movement is. So that's a good sign from our point of view.
I think they're even calling it, what was it, terrorists? Economic terrorists? Yeah, before they call it.
Yeah, insane.
Yes, insane. Really crazy, really over the top.
Yeah.
Right, Peter, just building on that, one of the objectives of BDS is justice for the Palestinians. What is justice for the Palestinians? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, look, the BDS movement has three platforms. And of course, BDS is complicated. I have to say I'm very sensitive to the criticisms of BDS. I have to be conscious of people like Norman Finkelstein and Chomsky, who I admire and respect, and they had certain reservations about BDS, so we can talk about that. But look, more directly, to answer your question, there are three planks to the BDS platform. One of them is, of course, ending the occupation, which includes the blockade of Gaza. That's obvious and straightforward, and really hardly deserves debate. It's so really uncontroversial. The occupation is a crime, and the blockade is a crime. The second plank is the right of return, which is complicated and controversial. But I think, and Sol could perhaps reinforce this, but legally, I think there's no question that there is a right enshrined in international law and in UN resolutions. I think it's 194. The complications of realizing it and giving effect to that, I think, are serious, and one has to talk about that. Chomsky has some important remarks about the practicability of it, but anyway, that's another plank of the BDS movement. And the third plank is the respecting the rights, as we talked about in the beginning, the whole question of apartheid and the rights of the Palestinians, of course, in Israel, and so the BDS has these as its main demands, really. That's the program.
And what would be justice for Palestinians? All three?
Well,
one at
least.
A time?
Yeah, that's the right question. Look, it's obviously justice. You're quite right. There's often this slogan that people want peace, but the right answer is it's not just peace. We want peace with justice, and justice means recognizing. I mean, look, it's not a complicated question. Sol is the expert on this. What does justice mean? It's, human rights. It's not like it's difficult. It's not quantum physics. It's not rocket science. They should simply observe what are internationally recognized to be the human rights, and not to violate these rights in the most egregious ways, not to shoot dead innocent civilians. There are how many people are under administrative detention without any legal due process? There's endless ways in which one could realize justice, and it's a scandal that the world permits this. So, in a way, your question is too easy to answer.
All right. Now let's go on to sports. Yeah. They say we should always leave politics out of sports. Yet, through history, we see where sports and politics intertwine. I remember as a late teen how disappointed I was when the Moscow Olympics were boycotted because Russia invaded Afghanistan. And then 4 years later, the LA Olympics were boycotted. I had no clue, right, how boycott and politics and sports mixed in those days. But I remember my disappointment, right? And more recently, at the Tokyo Olympics, we had two judokas from Sudan and from Algeria refusing to play their Israeli opponent. Now, we can't possibly separate. Politics is everywhere, right? Politics is just in our life, right? Let's talk about this a bit, right? Politics and sports. Should we leave politics out? Saul?
Well, the people who are always, crying out and saying that politics should be left out of sports, I've generally found are the people who are benefiting from their privileges now and benefiting from the current system, and they don't want people protesting at sports. I mean, you mentioned some of the times where governments have used, like with the boycotting of the Olympics, governments have used sporting occasions to make a political point. But I'm thinking more of situations where, for example, athletes have used the platform given to them at international, mega sporting events, or just by virtue of the fact of being a celebrity, by being a sports, some kind of acclaimed sports player. And, I was thinking, for example, of the movement in the United States where American football players used to take the knee instead of standing for the national anthem. Yeah. And, the people that were going crazy about this were not the people who were suffering from police brutality, left and right. No, they were the people who benefited from this system. They're the people who, benefit from the privileges and special treatment that they get from the economic system as a whole and from the police in particular. So, I personally, I think that I don't see any problem with, certainly with sports athletes using mega sporting events to make those kind of political points. And I really admire what the two judoka did. And also there was I think a chess player. This is not an Olympics, a chess. You call these, not sure if he's called a player or what, but a chess person, 14 years old, who refused to play an Israeli player. And if you just think of the years and years of work and hard work that they've put in to getting to that point, to reaching that point, and yet they made a principled decision not to recognize through their actions the state of Israel. I think that's, personally, I think that's very admirable. And, I also want to make the point that, again, when we look at South Africa, one of the things that really brought the apartheid regime down was the international sporting boycott. That's right. It wasn't, and this is almost no economic punch. I mean, if South Africa were holding the Olympics and that were boycotted, that's a different thing. But it's just to not allow South African athletes to come to international sporting events. This is a huge blow to their international legitimacy. And that, when we look at, what were the specific measures that really brought the apartheid regime down, this always comes up, the sporting boycott, because it made us, the South Africans, realize just how much the world was unhappy with us, just how much the world viewed our system as illegitimate. And that's why I think it's a good thing. I really admire the two judoka and the Olympics, and I think I think those things should continue for sure. Yeah,
it's a 14-year-old Mauritanian at the
Mauritania, yes, sir.
Yeah, chess championships, yeah. And I keep thinking, right, at 14 to make that decision, that's really courage. I mean, it's truly admirable.
It's really something.
And it's really isolation, isn't it? It's isolating, and just as South Africa was isolated, it's about isolating Israel, right? That legitimacy comes into question. All right, gentlemen, time to get a little personal. Yeah. Saul, you mentioned that you spent 5 years in the West Bank under the auspices of the United Nations. Care to tell us a little bit about that? What was it like? Did it leave an indelible impression then, now, especially in your current activism and work at the university?
Well, I mean, of course, it left a very, it left a very strong impression. I mean, you'd have to be really dense not to be shocked by the daily oppression that I was. I mean, in a way, I was privileged to see it I say that, I mean, that didn't come out right, but I think what I'm trying to say is that, I was there, I was able to see with my own eyes some of the horrendous oppression that the Palestinian people were suffering, but I knew it would never happen to me. I knew it would never, touch me. And so I was in a very privileged position, but at least I got to see it. And, that was quite an amazing thing. I think like a lot of, you have, there are two sort of different types, I would say, of UN people or internationals who come to Palestine. You have people who have been studying about Palestine and about the Arab world, and, they're fluent in Arabic. I remember in another agency, there was somebody who was fluent in Bedouin Arabic. It was amazing. And so, where else are they going to work? Or they're going to come to Palestine, of course. And, you have those people who have been thinking about Palestine for, pretty much their entire adult lives. And then you have the second category of people who have really just, they haven't really thought about it. They're not experts on the situation there. And they just, by luck of the draw, they ended up there. And I was of that group. In fact, the situation in Palestine was a situation that I'd always sort of steered clear of, just because it seemed very complicated. I think like a lot of people, who had spent, who had grown up in the Western world, and who had been influenced in many ways by the discourse within Western countries. I'm thinking I was in the United States. Palestine to me seemed very complicated. It seemed very untouchable. It was one of those things that people didn't really want to talk about in polite society. So I didn't know that much about it. To be brutally frank, I mean, I prepared for an interview and I prepared to go to the office, but I was not an expert in Palestine. And I think I went with a vaguely, like all international civil servants, I went with, trying to project a sense of impartiality. And I went with, and I think I was very sort of neutral in my mind. I had a very sort of vague concept of Israel as being a democratic country, just like the rest of the Western world. I mean, I really do think I'd been influenced by that kind of discourse. But like I'm like a colleague of mine in a different UN agency said, he put it very succinctly and very well. Look, we're all international civil servants. We come here, we act, impartial. We always have to show our impartiality. That's our job. We got no choice. But if you come here and after 1 week you're still impartial in your heart, well, there's something wrong with you. And it's true. I mean, you no amount of amnesty reports or short, social media videos or anything, no amount of that can prepare you for the kind of things you actually see. And it's so in your face and such on a daily basis and very much in your face that was that left a very strong impression. I think one thing that maybe I won't take too much time on this, but one thing that always sticks in my mind, I've seen interviewed people, their fathers were shot in front of them, all this kind of stuff, and I'm a human rights lawyer. This is what I do, so that's okay. But one thing that really still now sticks in my mind is the situation at Kalandia, which is the main checkpoint that goes from Ramallah into East Jerusalem. And Palestinians, East Jerusalemites, and also 48 Palestinians, if they have an Israeli plate on their car, they can actually drive through. It's one of the very few checkpoints that Palestinians can take cars through. But they have to stop at the checkpoint, and they have to get out and show the ID document. They have to open the boot for the soldier themselves. The soldier never opens the boot himself. I guess that's for security reasons, and also to make sure that he doesn't steal anything. But anyway, the point is, it's a sort of stop-go, and it creates this huge bottleneck before the checkpoint, because you have this huge amount of cars that are trying to go into East Jerusalem, and it's stop go. Each car takes about 5-10 minutes, maybe longer if there's some kind of issue. But anyway, so there was a speaker where the soldiers inside the sort of watchtower, not the watchtower, but the sort of structure, they were barking out orders to the cars, saying, stop, start. No, you in the white one, stop. You in the white car. Okay, come. And so you have this soldier. He's in the thing. And he's screaming out orders over the loudspeaker, but the orders were in Hebrew, and that's what really somehow just like slapped me in the face. I mean, you see this terrible oppression, like you mentioned, Peter, administrative, arbitrary detention, whisking away children in the middle of the night, taking them to prisons, and shooting people, everything. But for me, what really this really slapped me in the face, because it just seemed like this sheer humiliation. This we're going to steal your land, we're going to arrest we're going to throw your men in jail, we're going to we're going to treat you, we're going to violate every single internationally recognized human right that there is, and we're not even going to have the courtesy to speak your language when we're talking to you. It's the language of the oppressor, and you better get used to it. That's how I took it, and that was really a big slap. It was like I was slapped in the face. It was I saw it and I was like, wow, this is really bad. This is how bad you can get, because it's not just I'm a human rights lawyer, so I look at the human rights violations, specific human rights violations, but it's also the humiliation, the daily humiliation of having to go through these checkpoints. Going to work used to be a 20-minute drive. Now it's 3 hours, 4 hours. You have to get out. You have to show, walking to school, your children walking to school. They have to go through these checkpoints, open their bags, and harassed and pushed around. Young women are, glared at by young Israeli men, and, give suggestive comments. It's this daily humiliation, to me, that really sort of defines the whole situation that Palestinians are in. So that was, that left a big impression, as you can see.
I'm sure. I spent a month there about 10 years ago in Jerusalem, and I took that opportunity to drive the length and breadth, and I had so much freedom. I crossed some of these checkpoints, including Kalandia, and I can tell you this: I didn't want to look the Palestinians in their face. I did not want to do that, be guilty, and I could see all that was written on their faces. All I had to do was wave my passport, and I could go through any checkpoint, breeze through it, right? And there they were with anxiety etched in their faces, not knowing if they were going to get through or how long it would take. I really did not want to look them in their faces at all. That guilt in me was just too much to bear.
No, I completely understand.
Yeah, and Peter, coming back to you, your family survived the horrific Nazi concentration camps. Yeah, you have another perspective to this equation. Can you talk a little bit about that? As a survivor family of who went through the Nazi concentration camps, how has that impacted you personally? And what about your relationship within the Jewish community in Australia, specifically in Sydney itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's a tricky question. Thank you for asking about that. Look, just briefly, the basic facts are that both my parents, my mother and father, my mother and grandmother survived Auschwitz, which is the death camp, the extermination camp. They were lucky, and I grew up with their stories. In fact, my mother recounted regularly, of course, she would repeat these stories, seeing Mengele, the angel of death, they called him, who was at the railway siding when she arrived, separating them out, those that went straight to the gas chamber. And I won't go through all of her stories, but so they had horrific experiences, and most of the family were exterminated, and my mother and grandmother survived. And my father was in Nazi, up in the Ukraine, in the Pripyat marshes, where there was a slave labor, where thousands of people died there. So that was my background. But the relevant connection with Palestine is interesting to reflect on. I grew up with somehow a different message from what many Jews grew up learning from this experience. There's the slogan, never again, and Jews use this in a very unfortunate way. It came up, in fact, with Hannah Arendt's trial, her book on the trial of Eichmann, where the Jews interpreted this, the Holocaust, as a crime against Jews, And she was offended by this and said, no, it's a crime against humanity. The Jews were the victims in this case, but Jews haven't wanted to generalize and wanted to see these crimes in a certain way. And they've always sadly taken never again in this narrow way to mean never again to Jews. Well, Edward Said, who is a great hero in this, makes the point, and some other people I admire, Jews especially, I'll mention in a minute. The lesson should be never again to anybody. And now, of course, we're not the victims, we're the perpetrators. And that's the way in which I somehow got the message. I was lucky to have parents that were, for one thing, I'll tell you something funny about this. My mother's close cousin I grew up with here, who was my uncle in a way, he was the federal head of the JNF in Australia, which is the Jewish National Fund, the Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, which is the worst organization, sort of quasi-government organization to expropriate Palestinian land. So, but I grew up in a household where my parents weren't particularly Zionist, and they never sent me to Zionist youth camps, where many of my friends went to summer camp. I thought I missed out on having fun in summer camps. But what this meant was that I didn't get indoctrinated in quite the same way as many Jews did. So I managed to somehow have a more open mind and was able to be influenced by the things I read later on to see the Palestinian case and reading people, some of my heroes like Noam Chomsky, as I mentioned already, who was and still is one of the great heroes, I think, and champions of human rights generally around the world, but especially for the Palestinians. So that was the sort of a story that it was somehow different in some ways to many of the other Jews. But of course, I admire several of the other Jews and let me mention while I have the opportunity, and I'll quote him if I may, which gives you the flavor of my own instinctive attitude. Norman Finkelstein had a similar history, and he has been very passionate, and he puts it in the way that I instinctively did, that he stands for the Palestinians because of the lessons he learned from his parents, by getting what I think is the right lesson from that. Let me quote something he said. It was an occasion, a publication, which got a lot of YouTube attention, where a woman in the audience in one of his speeches was upset and said something about how Jews in the audience were upset by things he said. And let me just read out, I have it in front of me here, what he said, and it's the best way to capture my own feelings towards it. He mentioned, of course, that his father was also a survivor of Auschwitz, and his mother was in Majdanek, another concentration camp, and every member of his family, like mine, were exterminated. And he said the following, which I find very moving always, and let me read it to you. He said, "It's precisely and exactly because of the lessons my parents taught me and my two siblings that I will not be silent when Israel commits its crimes against the Palestinians." He says, "And I consider nothing more despicable than to use their suffering and their martyrdom to try to justify the torture and the brutalization, the demolition of homes that Israel daily commits against the Palestinians." And he said to that girl who was in tears, he said, "If you had any heart in you, you'd be crying for the Palestinians." I find that very moving, and I think that's the message that I think is the right one for Jews, and it's very hard to get them to see it in those terms because, as you know, they shamefully exploit the Holocaust to excuse everything that Israel does. And so I've taken that sort of message to heart, and I find that that's really the reason that, like Finkelstein says, we have to stand up for the Palestinians. I have family in Israel, I should mention. And my mother's closest cousin, he has still the tattoo on his arm from Auschwitz. And he's, bless him, he's 92 years old now, or 93. And so it's an interesting tension. But just one other thing, since you asked, you'd be perfectly aware of the reaction of the Jewish community generally. Look, people often say to me that, oh, it's very brave and so on to stand up. But actually, look, I'm not a modest person, but I can't accept praise when it's not quite deserved. For me, it's not so difficult. Look, if you're inside the Jewish community, look, I married a Catholic. You know, I developed my life outside. I'm still closely connected. And I get the shit that is thrown, you know, at dissenting Jews. I've had my share of that. But I don't want to overstate that, because the reality is it's not as difficult as people make out. So you put up with a certain amount of abuse, but it's not as difficult as people think. And I think that the people who are inside the Jewish community, I have friends who would find it much more difficult. Their family and their friends would disown them. And I think that that's a large part of the difficulty. That I was just fortunate. I didn't have that sort of obstacle to break away from my own biases. I didn't have that. I didn't go to those Zionist youth camps, so I didn't have to undo my Zionist brainwashing, which they all got. One of my friends now, we talk about it. They're all part of this. Look, I tell you something funny about how much they have to get rid of. One of my friends who grew up in Israel, when 67 came along, he came to Australia when he was 11. But when the 1967 war came, he went back to help save Israel. They went back. It was all over by the time they got there. But this is the mindset which they have, and I had the good fortune of not having to undo that kind of brainwashing. So that's it. That's basically the story.
Wonderful. Now, one last question to both of you. Question posed by Professor Nazari, the chairman of BDS Malaysia. The US has now withdrawn from Afghanistan because the empire is overstretched. Apparently, it's too costly for the US. Do you think the same factor may cause the US to one day withdraw support for Israel? That it's too costly to support its apartheid policies? Let's start with Saul.
Well, like I said before, the writing is already on the wall with this, I think. Afghanistan and the U.S. support for Israel, of course, these are quite different animals. But I mean, the strength of the Israel lobby within the United States, and also which also includes the sort of religious factor, Christian Zionism and the evangelicals and all this kind of thing. And it's a much more historical thing as well. I mean, when you talk about history in the United States, it's hard to put the two in the same sentence, of course, but what short history the United States does have, I mean, there is a history of sort of political involvement with Zionist, organizations and like that. So it is, they're different animals, but the writing is on the wall. I think there's no question, but it has to come from within the United States. That is to say, it has to come, and it is coming from the American people themselves. I mean, there is a noticeable shift in public opinion. And there's a noticeable shift in public opinion about why is it the United States is giving all this support, all this money, and all this political support and legitimacy to the state of Israel when all it seems to do is get us in trouble, A, and B, it's also perpetuating this apartheid regime, which is brutally oppressing the Palestinian people. And it's, again, there's a noticeable shift. It's definitely going to happen. Whether it's going to happen in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, this I don't know. But one thing that, there's actually this short video that I often use in my classes at university. It's from the Democratic Convention of 2000, and I think it was 12. And if you Google this, and you'll find it on Al Jazeera, I think. I mean, you'll see what happens. But the Democratic Party, I mean, both parties adopt a party platform before the presidential elections, saying that our candidate will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And of course, this happened later on with Trump. We'll forget about that now. But in 2012, this has not happened yet. And what had always happened, of course, is that the party platform had been adopted, and the president waltzes in and he says, well, we can't really do this now. And that sort of just gets, forgotten about. The party platforms themselves really don't have that much of an impact on what the president does after he assumes office. Anyway, but so in 2012, they printed the party platform, which is very thick, a very big document. And somehow what happened was this bit about recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel had been left out. Now, nobody really knows why this happened. Obama says that it was just some kind of mistake. Nobody knows what, at least I don't know why it happened, and it's not been made public as to why it happened. But so it happened. I mean, it was printed, the delegates were all at the convention, and all of a sudden somebody realized, hey, where's our usual stuff about Jerusalem? And so what they had to do is they had to introduce a motion saying, we want to reintroduce this language into the party platform. We've always had it, and so this is normal stuff. So you had the party hacks, the sort of democratic, the powerful people in the Democratic Party. They're waltzing in. There's a guy, yeah, you know, so we're going to adopt a motion, and you know, everybody's just going to say aye, and it's no problem. And half of the room said aye, and at least half of the room, probably more than half, screamed no. And you know, these are Democratic Party activists. Many of them are young, but you know, they're obviously they're closely affiliated with one of the two political parties in the United States. And it's amazing because you see these, you know, these sort of powerful people. I forget who he was. I think he was the mayor of Los Angeles or something, but a potential presidential hopeful at some point. And he's standing there, like, what's going on? What's going on? Like, he can't fathom what's going on. And then he said, well, we'll do it again. And he does it for a second time, and it's the same thing. And in fact, it's the no's that are clearly, you know, at least they have the louder voices. Mm-hmm. And he said, and then the head of the party comes. I can't remember if it was Pelosi or somebody. She comes and they're whispering to each other. It's like, what are we going to do? And they do it for a third time. And once again, the no's clearly carry the day. But he's saying, okay, well, you know, I'm the chair, and I've heard. I think it's been adopted by acclamation, and so we'll just move on. And to me, this really showed what was happening and what was at the time and what is still happening in the United States. With, you know, you have the political elite that are still clinging on to Israel as a security state, and you know, they're billionaire donors and all this kind of thing. But the people are more and more, you know, they are seeing what is happening. They are more knowledgeable of the human rights violations and the terrible oppression that is taking place, and they are moving away from blind support to Israel. So you know, there's no question that this is going to happen. It's just that what's happening now is that the political process in the United States basically does not reflect what most of the people are thinking. Yeah. But that has to change, and it will change, and it will. You know, it's not. You know, sort of getting back to Azra, something that you were asking about before, you know, are we really making any difference? It's easy to get cynical and negative, but when change happens, it can be very sudden. And I really do see it happening in the United States. Whether, again, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, this I don't know. But it will definitely happen because it's moving in that direction.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yes, look, I agree with everything Sol said, and I'll add something to that, which I think is evidence of that. The most significant thing in the last few years was the huge popularity of Bernie Sanders, and that, I think, I mean, in fact, of course, it was the Democrat Party itself that got rid of him. They undermined him and sabotaged him, the way they did, of course, the Labour Party in Britain with Corbyn. And the Bernie Sanders phenomenon is extraordinary on this Israel-Palestine issue. I mean, he used a taboo word for his own position, socialist, which was like, you know, you couldn't be a liberal and get elected in America before. And he was willing to run on that, which some people thought was ill-advised. But his position on Israel-Palestine was pretty good. And you could criticize it, but the fact that he talked the way he did without being prompted, he would volunteer issues about the rights of the Palestinians and so on. It was an extraordinary development in American political history. And the huge support that he had is further evidence for what Sol has been saying. Was it sad that he got, you know, sabotaged and didn't end up running because the Democrats basically couldn't face, not only on Israel-Palestine, he was too progressive on everything else, which was the same problem that Corbyn faced. And of course, the Israel lobby in England has been exposed as having been, you know, sinister forces undermining him from within the Labour Party in Corbyn's case. And the Israel lobby had its hand, of course, with Sanders as well. But that's the positive part of the story, that he could come forward with the kinds of views as a Jew that he did. And of course, as Sol says too, inside the Democrats, you've got the what do they call them? The women. What do they call
the squad? The squad.
Yes, yeah. Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, for all the rubbish they get, they're a very positive indicator of how things are changing. And so, look, the other thing I just add quickly, just to really agree with Sol, Israel is perhaps no longer for the long term going to be calculated as a strategic asset for the United States. And that's when things will change. when they decide that this is no longer in their own interest, it's not just the Israel lobby or the Christian fundamentalists that are the force behind it. America has always been regarding Israel as a strategic ally, and that may change. And then, of course, things will change very, very quickly. So there's reasons, as Saul says, to think that there may be hope for Palestine. Frankly, I think it'll only come from outside. I don't think there's any sign that inside Israel there's a chance. One of the questions, perhaps, that was part of the story is whether within inside Israel there's any hope for shift. I don't think so. The attitudes there are so way over to the right, and they're so racist, and so, as we were saying before, so blind. But it depends on America in every way. So yeah, I think there's grounds for optimism.
Thank you for that optimism, both of you. Now, final words, gentlemen, before we wrap up today's webinar. Peter, let's start with you.
I think I've said everything I want to say.
Okay, put your money where your mouth is. Is it what would you call it? A democracy, an apartheid state, a Jewish state? What would you say?
Well, if you really want to know, I'd call it a terror state, and a serial violator of human rights. I mean, we use that word terror. We abuse that because we talk about reactive, small-scale violence. And on any definition of terrorism, Israel is a terrorist state. So if you really want to know, that's what I'd call it.
Right. So, final word.
Yes, thanks. Well, I like Peter, I pretty much said everything I wanted to say. I like your characterization of Israel as a terrorist state. I think I'd go along with that too. It's definitely not a democracy. There's no question about that. And I think it's, I think apartheid state also fits the bill, if you like.
All right. Thank you very much, Saul and Peter, for a wonderful session. Fascinating indeed. And always lovely to see you. And we hope to see you in person next year at the
Inshallah.
I hope. Yeah. Thank you once again. And thank you to everyone for tuning in from wherever you're tuning in from. Good afternoon and goodbye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay.
While many associate the word with South Africa, apartheid is a universal legal term that refers to severe discriminatory oppression. Apartheid is also a crime against humanity. Its definition in the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is made up of three key elements: an intent to maintain the domination by one racial group over another, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts as part of that oppression. Persecution is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It is made up of two primary elements: a discriminatory intent leading to severe deprivation of fundamental rights of a racial, ethnic, or other group. On the basis of these definitions and its research, Human Rights Watch finds that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Human Rights Watch finds that the elements of the crimes come together in the occupied Palestinian territory, pursuant to an Israeli government policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians across Israel and the occupied territory. In the occupied territory, that intent has been coupled with systematic oppression and inhumane acts committed against Palestinians living there. The Israeli government is the main authority across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. In these areas, Israeli officials have demonstrated a discriminatory intent to maintain domination over Palestinians by ensuring control over land and demographics by Jewish Israelis. Take the Jerusalem municipality as an example. The Israeli authorities' goal is to maintain a sizable Jewish majority by boxing in Palestinian areas while helping predominantly Jewish areas to flourish. Israeli authorities maintain a two-tier system which privileges Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. The means used by Israeli authorities in the occupied territory amount to the systematic oppression needed to establish the crime of apartheid. Israeli authorities have committed a range of abuses against Palestinians. In the occupied territory, those abuses include mass land confiscation, the denial of residency rights, and the suspension of civil rights, and rise to the threshold of inhumane acts and severe abuses of the fundamental rights of Palestinians. The international community should recognize the reality on the ground for what it is and press the Israeli authorities to end apartheid and persecution.